Nobody tells you that loving someone honestly can still mean you were living inside a lie. I didn't figure that out in a single dramatic moment. It didn't come to me all at once. It arrived the way a slow leak does quietly, in small places, until one morning you realize the floor underneath you has been rotting for a long time. Her name was Diane, and for nearly 2 years, I believed she was exactly who she said she was. Let me back up, because you need to understand where I'm coming from before any of this makes sense. My name is Leonard Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher and football coach at Roosevelt High in Knoxville, Tennessee. I retired 4 years ago when my knees finally filed their formal complaint, and I've been living quietly in the same house I bought with my first wife, Carol, back in 1987. Carol passed from cancer 11 years ago. I raised our two boys, James and Darius, mostly on my own after that. They're both grown now. James is in Charlotte, Darius is in Nashville, and they turned out better than I deserved, considering how many years I was running on grief and black coffee. I am not a man who does things halfway. My mother, Ruth Calloway, raised me in a small house in East Knoxville with the specific kind of love that doesn't tolerate nonsense but never runs out either. Sunday dinners at our house weren't optional. They were a covenant. You showed up, you ate together, you talked about the week, and you thanked God you still had people to sit across from. My mother did that until she was 81. When she passed, my brother Cecil and I made sure the tradition continued at my house, because some things aren't allowed to die just because the person who started them is gone. So when I tell you I met Diane Weston at a charity fundraiser for the Roosevelt High Athletic Department, she worked in development for a local foundation, and that inside 3 months I was completely gone on this woman, I need you to understand what that means from a man like me. I do not fall easily. I had not been seriously involved with anyone in 7 years. My boys had given up politely, trying to set me up. My brother Cecil had started making the kinds of jokes that aren't really jokes. And then Diane walked in wearing a burgundy blazer, laughing at something the athletic director said, and I stood there holding a glass of sweet tea like I'd never seen a woman before in my life. She was 58. Sharp, warm, funny in the dry way that sneaks up on you. She'd lived in Knoxville for 12 years, originally from somewhere in Ohio, she said. She had a condo downtown, a good career, a wide circle of friends. My mother would have liked her. That was the thing I kept coming back to. My mother would have genuinely liked this woman. We dated for 14 months. She came to Sunday dinner inside the first 6 weeks and didn't flinch once when Cecil started asking questions before the cornbread even cooled. She learned that my brother takes his coffee black and remembers things like that. She helped my daughter-in-law, Tamara, in the kitchen without being asked. By month 4, she knew which chair belonged to nobody, because that had been my mother's chair, and she never sat in it without asking first. My family opened up to her the way families do when they recognize someone who fits. I proposed on a Tuesday evening in November, on the back porch of my house, with the mountains just visible in the last of the light. Nothing fancy. A ring, her name, and a question I'd been working up to for 2 months. She said yes before I finished the sentence. My sons called me that same night. James said, "Dad, it's about time." Darius said, "I already told Tamara." Cecil said, "Ruth's watching and she's happy." I went to bed that night feeling like a man who had been given a second chance he didn't entirely deserve, and I intended to honor it. I had no idea what was already buried underneath all of it. Friends, if you're just finding this channel, pull up a chair. Get comfortable. This story is going to take you somewhere. Hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I genuinely read every single one. Here is what you need to know about how Diane handled the subject of her family, because it matters. She brought it up herself. Early. That was the thing. She didn't wait for me to ask. About 2 months into us spending real time together, we were sitting on my porch on a Saturday afternoon, and she just said it, quietly. The way someone says something they've been carrying for a while and finally decided to put down. "My parents and I don't have a relationship," she said. "Haven't for a long time. My father was emotionally abusive when I was growing up. My mother enabled it. I had to step away for my own health. They won't be at the wedding, if we ever get there. I need that to be something you can accept." I looked at her. She wasn't performing it. Her voice was level and tired, the voice of someone recounting an old wound, not a fresh one. I told her I understood. I told her family situations are complicated, and I wasn't going to push. I told her I trusted her. I did, completely. That is the part I have to sit with. What I didn't account for was my family. Not because they were cruel to Diane, they weren't, not even close. But the Calloway family operates with a specific gravitational pull toward knowing people. Not just the person in front of you, but where they come from, who raised them, what their people are like. My mother used to say you can tell a lot about a person by how they speak about the ones who raised them, even the ones who raised them badly. It wasn't judgment. It was just how we understood the world. By the time we were 9 months into the engagement, the silence around Diane's family had developed its own kind of weight at Sunday dinners. Cecil never said anything direct, but I caught him and Darius exchanging a look once when Diane deflected a question about her childhood, and I knew what the look meant because I'd been having the same thought and refusing to acknowledge it. The thing that broke it open was not dramatic. It was a piece of paper. Diane had asked me to help her update her car insurance after we got engaged, since we were planning to consolidate our policies before the wedding. I had her documents on my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon in early spring. I'm 63. I still deal with paper, and I was going through them when I noticed something on her Ohio driver's license that didn't match. Her emergency contact, which she'd listed for the insurance renewal, had a last name I hadn't seen before. Not Weston. Hargrove. Ruth Ann Hargrove, listed as mother, with a phone number and an address in Millbury, Ohio. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. Diane had told me her mother's name was Patricia, that both her parents had moved out of state years ago, that she had no real contact with them. Weston was her name. I'd assumed it was her married name from a previous marriage she'd mentioned briefly. I'd never thought to look closer. Why would I? Ruth Ann Hargrove, Millbury, Ohio. I didn't call Diane. I didn't confront her. I did what I've done for 31 years when I encounter something that doesn't add up. I went looking for more information before I opened my mouth. It took me 2 days. A property records search. An old Facebook profile with privacy settings that hadn't been updated in years. A phone number still listed in an online directory. On a Thursday morning, I drove to my brother Cecil's house and sat across from him at his kitchen table and told him what I was about to do. He listened. When I finished, he said, "You want me to come with you?" I told him no. He said, "Then call me when you leave." That was the whole conversation. That's Cecil. I called Ruth Ann Hargrove from a gas station parking lot off I-75 north of Cincinnati, about 40 minutes from Millbury. I didn't plan exactly what I would say. I introduced myself. I told her my name. I told her I was engaged to her daughter. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, in a voice so carefully steady it broke my heart just to hear it, "Leonard." "Oh, my lord. Where are you right now?" Friends, nothing in 31 years of teaching prepared me for what I found when I knocked on the door of that house on Sycamore Street in Millbury. Ruth Ann Hargrove opened the door, and she looked at me the way people look when they've been waiting for something for so long they'd stopped believing it would actually come. She was 71 years old, small, with silver hair pulled back and eyes that were red around the rims from crying since I'd called. Behind her, standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets, was her husband, Donald Hargrove, 73, retired electrician. A thick, quiet man with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to hold a lot inside without letting it spill. They brought me into their living room, the kind of room that tells you everything about who lives there, framed cross-stitch on the walls. A china cabinet with photos arranged carefully inside. High school graduation picture. College graduation picture. A photo of Diane at what looked like a birthday party, maybe 10 or 11 years old, laughing so hard she was leaning sideways. Donald Hargrove in a suit, not a man who wore suits often, you could tell, and Ruth in a floral dress, both of them beaming. A family that loved their daughter. A family that had kept every picture. These were not abusive people. I knew it the moment I sat down. Some things you just know after 6 decades of watching human beings. The story came out, slowly, carefully, the way painful things do when people haven't had a safe place to put them for a long time. Diane had grown up in Millbury. Good student, ambitious, left for Columbus for college on a partial scholarship they'd helped cover with savings. They were proud, deeply proud. She'd built a career in nonprofit development, moved around Columbus, then Cincinnati, then eventually Knoxville. As she moved up, the calls got shorter. The visits stopped. She started introducing herself at work events with a different last name, Weston, which was her maternal grandmother's maiden name, and eventually stopped correcting people who assumed that was her legal name. The break came 2 years ago, at Christmas. Diane had called to tell them about our engagement. According to Ruth, the conversation had been warm at first. But when Donald mentioned that they couldn't afford to contribute much to the wedding, he'd had a heart procedure the year before, the bills had taken most of their savings, Diane had gone cold. She said she needed them to show up for her the way she'd always showed up for them. Donald said they had always shown up for her. The conversation ended badly. She stopped returning calls within a week, blocked their numbers within a month. Ruth opened the small drawer in the end table beside the couch. She pulled out a stack of envelopes, maybe 8 or 9 of them, held together with a rubber band, cards they had mailed to Diane's condo address in Knoxville over the past 2 years. Birthday cards. A Christmas card. A card with no occasion marked on the outside, just a card. Because sometimes you send a card because you need the person to know you're still there. Every single one had been returned unopened. Address unknown, even though they had her correct address. Diane had clearly flagged her own name at the post office. I was still sitting there holding those envelopes when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Diane. "Honey, I have the best news." I reached out to my parents. We had a long talk, and they apologized for everything. They want to fly down and meet you next weekend before the wedding. I'm so happy. This is everything I wanted. I read that message 3 times. Then I looked up at Ruth Ann Hargrove, who was watching me with careful, quiet eyes. I turned my phone around and showed her the screen. She read it. She set the phone down gently on the cushion between us. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the window. Donald looked at me, just looked at me. The look of a man who has run out of things to be surprised by, but still feels every one of them. I drove back to Knoxville that evening with the windows down and the radio off, and I understood for the first time that I had not been living the story I thought I was living. I did not confront Diane when I got home. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. She was in the kitchen making dinner when I walked in. She looked up and smiled. I kissed her on the cheek and asked how her day was. She talked about work. I talked about mine. We ate together. She mentioned her parents coming to visit again and said she thought they could all have dinner at Tupelo Honey downtown. She seemed genuinely happy, the specific happiness of a person whose plan is working. I spent that night lying in the dark, making a list. What I knew, her real name was Hargrove. Her parents were alive, healthy in spirit if not perfectly in body, 60 miles away in Ohio, and had no idea she'd told me they were estranged for reasons of abuse. She had blocked their mail. She had sent me a text claiming a reconciliation while I was sitting in their living room. She was now building a follow-up lie, which meant she already had someone in mind to play the role of her reconciled parents. I started paying attention to names. Over the following week, she mentioned a woman named Carolyn Pressler more than I'd heard her mentioned before. Carolyn, her foundation's executive director, a woman of considerable standing in Knoxville's philanthropic community. Her husband, Robert Pressler, a retired federal judge, old money, gracious people, well-regarded. Exactly the kind of couple you'd want standing next to you if you were trying to make an impression on a traditional Southern family. I looked them up from my office on a Tuesday morning, door closed. Found their photo at a foundation gala 2 years earlier. I sat back in my chair, and I thought about Diane, and about what it takes to convince 2 genuinely distinguished people to sit down at a dinner table and tell a room full of strangers that you are their daughter. I thought about what story she must have told them. Something moving. Something that made them feel they were doing something kind. I called Donald Hargrove from my truck that afternoon. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I believed was being planned. I told him what I wanted to do. The line was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from us?" I told him. He said, "Tell me where and when, and we'll be there." The following Sunday, I drove to Cecil's house. I sat across from him the same way I had before, and I laid it all out. The Hargroves, the cards, the text, Carolyn and Robert Pressler, all of it. Cecil listened without interrupting, which is not natural for him, and tells you something about how seriously he was taking it. When I finished, he was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then he said, "Where are we doing this?" I told him. He stood up, straightened his shirt, and said, "I'll handle the seating." My son Darius, when I called him, did not say much. He said, "Dad, you sure about this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then I'll be there." James too. He didn't ask another question. That's my boys. We used the private dining room at Keaton's Grill House on Market Street, a place my family has gone for important occasions since before James was born. The kind of restaurant where the servers know your name and the manager, a man named Earl, has been there long enough to understand that sometimes a reservation is about more than dinner. I called Earl myself on Monday. I told him I needed the private room, a specific seating arrangement, and that there would be a point in the evening when 2 additional guests would need to be brought in from a side entrance. Earl said, "I'll be here early." That's all he said. I called Donald Hargrove on Thursday evening to confirm. His voice was measured, deliberate. At the end of the call, after we'd gone through the details, he said quietly, "Leonard, I want you to know something. Whatever happens in that room on Saturday, she's still our daughter. We're not coming to punish her. We're coming because someone finally asked us to show up, and we're not going to waste it." I didn't have the right words for that. I just told him I'd see him Saturday. I pressed my sport coat on Friday night. I checked the ring box in my dresser drawer, not the engagement ring, which Diane was wearing. The secondary ring I'd been carrying as a quiet symbol of what I'd hoped this was going to be. I put it in my jacket pocket and I went to bed. Diane spent 2 hours getting ready Saturday evening. She came out of the bedroom looking lovely, and I told her so. Because it was true. That was never the issue. I drove us to Keaton's. She talked about how glad she was her parents had finally come around. She squeezed my hand at the red light on Magnolia and said she felt like everything was finally falling into place. I nodded. I kept my eyes on the road. We arrived. The private dining room was warm and candlelit. My brother Cecil was already there, along with Darius and Tamara and James, who had driven from Charlotte that morning. My mother's tradition carried to a new table. When Diane walked in, she moved around the room with the ease of a woman who was confident in the performance she was about to give. She was gracious, warm, charming. Everything I had fallen in love with turned into a stage set. Carolyn and Robert Pressler arrived at 7 on the dot. Carolyn wore pearls and moved with the practiced warmth of someone who attends a great many events and genuinely enjoys them. Robert shook hands with a federal judge's quiet authority. Diane embraced Carolyn and laughed at something Robert said, and the laugh landed half a step too quick. I noticed. Nobody else did. I was introduced to Robert as Diane's stepfather, in her new telling Carolyn as her mother. I shook both their hands warmly. I said it was wonderful to finally meet the people who'd shaped so much of who Diane was. Carolyn smiled and said Diane was like family to them. Robert nodded and said they were proud of the woman she'd become. Like family. Not family, but close enough to fill 2 chairs. We sat. Earl and his staff brought food. The table filled with the kind of conversation that happens when good food and careful people occupy the same room. Cecil was holding himself together with visible effort. I could see it in his jaw. Darius kept his eyes on me. James watched Diane. Tamara refilled water glasses and said the right things and was the most composed person at the table. I waited. At 20 minutes past 8, in the brief exhale between the main course and what was meant to come next, I set my fork down. I tapped my water glass with a knife. The room settled. Diane looked at me with a full, open smile. The smile of a woman who believes the next 60 seconds are going to be the most loving moment of her evening. I let the silence sit for just a moment. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," I said. My voice was even unhurried the way I used to talk to my players before a hard game when I needed them to be steady. In my family, a table like this isn't just a nice dinner. It's a declaration. It means, these people are real, they matter, and we don't say that lightly. I looked slowly around the table. My mother raised me to believe that the people you invite into a moment like this reveal exactly who you are. So I want to make sure we have the right people in this room tonight. I looked at Earl, who was standing near the side wall. He had been told. He knew his moment. He stepped to the side door and opened it. And Donald and Ruth Ann Hargrove walked in. Donald in a dark blazer he'd clearly pressed that morning, the kind of jacket a man saves for occasions that matter. Ruth in a deep green dress, her silver hair neat, her chin up, moving with the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that whatever comes through that door, she is going to meet it standing straight. They crossed the threshold and Diane saw them. I was watching her face. I had positioned my chair for exactly that reason. The color did not drain slowly. It left all at once, like a light going out. Her lips parted. The hand that was resting on the table went completely still. The wine glass in her other hand tilted, and I reached across without looking and steadied it and set it quietly on the cloth. She turned to me. Her eyes were doing the rapid, desperate arithmetic of someone who is searching for the version of this story that still ends in her favor. There wasn't one. She knew it. I could see the moment she knew it. Diane. My voice was low. Not for the room. For her. I drove to Millbury 3 weeks ago. I knocked on the door of the house on Sycamore Street because I wanted to do something I should have done a long time ago. I wanted to know your people before I stood in front of God and everybody and made promises. I paused. I found a man in his backyard who hadn't heard his daughter's voice in 2 years. I sat in your mother's living room, and she showed me a stack of cards she'd mailed you, birthday cards, Christmas cards, every one of them returned unopened. And while I was sitting right there at their kitchen table, you sent me a text telling me your parents had apologized and wanted to fly down to meet me. The room was absolutely silent. Your father had a heart procedure last year. He offered what he could for the wedding. You told him that if he couldn't invest in your future, he didn't have a place in it. And then you went looking for someone to put in that place. I turned to Carolyn and Robert Pressler. Carolyn's hands were flat on the table in front of her, her face pale. Robert had gone very still in the way that certain men do when they are processing something that has fundamentally altered their understanding of a situation. Carolyn, Robert, I think I know what she told you. Something about a difficult estrangement, a family that didn't understand her, needing people she trusted to stand in for them so she wouldn't face a traditional Southern family dinner alone. You're kind people, and she used your kindness the way someone uses a tool, to fill 2 chairs that were always meant for someone else. I looked toward the door, where Donald and Ruth stood quietly. Those are her parents. They drove 3.5 hours this morning. They've been in a hotel in West Knoxville since noon. Her father called me last Thursday night to confirm the plan, and the last thing he said to me was that they weren't coming to punish her. They were coming because someone finally asked them to show up. The room held its breath. Carolyn looked at Diane. It was not an angry look. It was something worse, a slow, full recognition. The look of a woman understanding that the person she thought she knew had never quite existed. Robert folded his napkin with deliberate care and placed it beside his plate. He said nothing. He didn't need to. I reached into the jacket pocket where I had been carrying that ring. I set it on the white tablecloth in front of Diane. Not thrown, not slid. Placed, the way you set something down when you've been carrying it longer than it was ever meant to be carried, and you're finally ready to let it rest. Then I pushed back my chair, and I walked to where Ruth Ann Hargrove was standing. She was holding herself together by something that looked like sheer determination and nothing else. Jaw tight, shoulders straight, eyes bright with everything she was working not to let fall in a room full of strangers. I took her hand in both of mine. She looked at me for a moment. Then something gave way, not loudly, not with any drama, just the quiet giving way of a woman who has been braced against a door for 2 years and finally the door is open. She pressed her free hand to her mouth and her shoulders dropped, and the sound she made was barely a sound at all, just the release of something that had been held too long in too small a space. Donald put his arm around her. His jaw was working. His eyes were wet, and he didn't look away. He held her, and he looked at me, and then he looked down, once, and cleared his throat, and held out his hand. I shook it. He gripped hard. The grip of a man saying something his voice wasn't ready for yet. My brother Cecil appeared at my side. I don't know exactly when he moved, but Cecil appears when it matters. That's just who he is. He looked at Donald Hargrove for a moment. Then he said, "Brother, why don't you all come sit down? Earl's going to bring some more food out." And that was that. No speech. No ceremony, just the specific kindness of a Southern man who knows that the right response to a grieving family is to offer them a chair and a hot plate. Darius held the chair for Ruth. James was already talking to Donald quietly in the way my boys talk to older men they respect attentively, with their full attention. Tamara had somehow produced a clean handkerchief from somewhere and was pressing it into Ruth's hand without making a thing of it. My family. I turned back one last time. Diane was still at the table. Her dress was perfect. Her hair was perfect. Every detail of the evening she had built and managed and controlled was perfect, except for the people in the room, and she had not controlled those. Carolyn and Robert were at the far end of the room, Carolyn's coat already on, Robert's hand at her back. Neither of them looked at Diane as they moved toward the door. There was no argument to make, no version of events to offer. The Presslers were dignified, accomplished people, and they left with their dignity intact, which was more than Diane had left them room to do. Her friends, two couples she'd invited as guests, sat in their chairs with the stiff discomfort of people who have witnessed something they cannot unknow and don't know where to put their hands. Nobody went to her. I walked out with my family and Ruth and Donald Hargrove into the mild spring night on Market Street, Knoxville moving around us like it had no idea what had just happened inside that building. Cecil was already talking to Donald about fishing, which is exactly what Cecil does. Darius was on the phone telling his wife what she'd missed. James walked beside me and didn't say anything for half a block. And then he said, "Mom would have liked that, Dad." That was all. That was enough. Donald and Ruth stood together on the sidewalk. Ruth was still holding herself carefully, but her face had changed. Something had been released from around her eyes that had been there when I first arrived at their door. Donald looked at the lights of Market Street and breathed slowly, the way a man breathes when he's been holding himself tight for a long time and is finally letting go by degrees. He looked at me. He didn't say thank you. We were past thank you. He just looked at me with the eyes of a father who had been handed back something he'd stopped letting himself hope for, and he nodded once, slowly, the way men of a certain generation nod when words aren't the right tool for the job. I nodded back. Some things you do because it makes sense on paper. Some things you do because there is simply no other version of yourself you can live with. I spent 31 years in a classroom teaching young people that history is not made by the people who have the most power in the room. It's made by the people who are willing to do the honest thing when nobody's Proctor Cell, forcing them to. I didn't find a great love story on that sidewalk. I found something older, and maybe more important, the plain truth that the people who raised somebody, who saved for years so their daughter could leave a small Ohio town without debt, who mailed cards she never opened, who held the door open even when it kept getting shut in their face. Those people deserved to be in that room, not as a favor, not as a plot, just because it was right. The ring stayed on the tablecloth. Some things you don't take back. You just set them down and walk forward. If this story meant something to you, friends, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like and tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. I read everyone. We'll see you next time.